There are stories that command attention, stories so unexpected, so filled with irony that they demand to be told. Among these, one stands apart. It begins with a man driven by rage and righteousness, a man whose footsteps were feared, whose name sparked terror among the early followers of Jesus. He was not a villain in his own eyes. No, he believed he was a guardian of truth. And yet, his life became a canvas for something entirely different. This man, once known as Saul of Tarsus, became one of the most powerful voices ever to proclaim the name of Christ. There was a time when the sound of Saul's voice meant destruction. His name traveled faster than his sandals could carry him, leaving behind it a trail of broken families, empty homes, and trembling hearts. The followers of Jesus did not simply avoid him. They prayed for protection against him. They hid in fear of him. This man, educated in the finest traditions, spoke with authority and clarity. But his purpose then was to silence the gospel, not spread it. He was not a criminal, not in the eyes of his community. Saul believed himself to be obedient, even faithful. He clung to the laws handed down from generation to generation. He saw this rising sect of Christians as dangerous, blasphemous, and worthy of extinction. In his mind, he was preserving purity. In his heart, he was convinced that his violence was service to God. And this, perhaps, is what makes his story so compelling. It is not a tale of a man who was evil in the obvious ways, but one who was blinded by a zeal that felt holy. History remembers many conversions, many transformations, many changes of heart, but few are as jarring, as abrupt, and as complete as this one. How can the same hands that once tore apart the church later write the very letters that would hold it together for 2,000 years? How can the same voice that called for the stoning of believers later echo across nations with words of mercy, grace, and love? How does one go from hunter to herald? This is not just a story of change. It is a story of redemption, of a man pursued by something stronger than his hate, of a mission interrupted by light, of a soul that fell hard and rose higher. Saul of Tarsus, enemy of Christ, became Paul the Apostle, servant of the risen Lord. And in his journey, we see the fingerprints of a divine plan that turns even the most stubborn resistance into unwavering obedience. At the heart of this transformation lies a mystery that invites every listener to lean in closer. What kind of power can reach that far? What kind of grace can cover so much guilt? What kind of purpose can rise from such ruins? Saul's life, at first glance, seems like a contradiction. But as his path unfolds, it becomes clear that the very traits that made him dangerous, his passion, his intellect, his conviction, were not erased. They were redirected. And in that redirection lies the hope for every soul who has ever walked the wrong path with confidence. This story is not a celebration of human will or personal growth. It is a testament to something greater. Saul did not climb out of darkness on his own. He was stopped. He was changed. And everything that followed, every word, every step, every risk he took, began with a divine interruption. The road ahead will reveal much. It will show the depth of his past, the force of his call, and the trials he endured. But for now, we simply stand at the threshold of something extraordinary. This is the beginning of a journey that proves no one is too far gone, no heart too hardened, no enemy too unreachable. It is the opening of a life that will shake empires, split history, and bring hope to millions. But it starts here with a man breathing threats, holding letters of authority and walking with the intent to destroy. He does not yet know that his next step will be into the arms of the very one he is trying to erase. Long before Paul would ever pen a letter to the faithful or proclaim the gospel to Gentiles in distant cities, he lived as a man cloaked in an intense and consuming zeal. To understand who he became, one must first understand who he was. Saul of Tarsus did not stumble into persecution, he pursued it with purpose. His hatred of the early Christian movement was not reckless or chaotic. It was calculated, structured, and born from a profound sense of religious duty. In his mind, there was no conflict between his violence and his righteousness. The more aggressively he opposed the followers of Jesus, the more faithful he believed himself to be. Tarsus, his birthplace, was no backwater village. It was a city known for its intellectual environment and cultural sophistication. As a Roman citizen by birth, Saul held a privilege that few Jews in the empire possessed. This status afforded him legal protections, access to elite education, and the freedom to travel across regions without hindrance. But Saul did not let the allure of Roman prestige define him. He identified deeply and unwaveringly with his Jewish heritage, a son of the tribe of Benjamin, proud of his ancestry and determined to uphold the traditions of his people. His roots ran deep into the soil of Jewish identity, and they formed a foundation upon which his zeal would grow unchecked. Central to that zeal was his training under Gamaliel, one of the most respected Pharisees of his time. Gamaliel was known for his wisdom and measured approach, a teacher of balance and moderation. Saul, however, absorbed not just the knowledge of the scriptures, but a burning conviction that the law must be protected at any cost. He had not only memorized the sacred texts, he had internalized them, and in doing so, he constructed a worldview in which any deviation from tradition was a threat that needed to be extinguished. The followers of Jesus were not seen as misguided. They were seen as dangerous blasphemers, undermining the authority of Moses and polluting the holiness of God's covenant. His persecution of the church was not a series of impulsive outbursts. It was methodical. Saul obtained official authorization from the religious leaders in Jerusalem, carrying letters that gave him the power to enter synagogues and arrest anyone who belonged to the way. He did not discriminate. Men and women alike were dragged from their homes, bound, and brought to face punishment. There was no mercy in his pursuit, no hesitation. He was convinced that this new movement was a cancer, and he believed it was his God-given responsibility to cut it out before it spread. But it was not only the external permission of the Sanhedrin that drove him. It was the internal fire of his own conscience. Saul did not imagine himself to be a villain. He saw himself as a guardian of the sacred, a defender of truth. Every stone cast, every door kicked open, every family shattered was, in his view, a sacrifice made on the altar of religious purity. He did not hate without reason. He hated with what he believed was holy conviction. This is what makes his story so complex. He was not a man without integrity. He was a man whose integrity had been deeply misdirected. Religious extremism is often born not from malice, but from fear. The fear that something cherished is being threatened, the fear that tradition is slipping, the fear that compromise is infecting the soul of a community. Saul's fear became fury, and his fury became a campaign of terror. But even in that darkness, there were signs of potential. Beneath the hard armor of legalism, there was a mind capable of deep thought and a heart capable of deep passion. Saul was not lukewarm. He was fully committed. And that level of commitment, though frightening in its present form, hinted at what might be possible if redirected toward the truth. The irony of Saul's story is that the very characteristics that made him dangerous to the church would later make him indispensable to it. His unrelenting nature, his brilliant mind, his fearless spirit, these were not flaws to be discarded. They were raw materials waiting to be transformed. But at this stage, transformation was not yet in view. He was still the man who stood by while Stephen was stoned, watching, approving, unmoved. He was still the one who entered homes not to bless, but to bind. He was still the enemy of the message he would soon give his life to proclaim. This chapter of Saul's life is not an interruption in his story. It is the necessary beginning. Without it, the transformation would not be so profound. Without the darkness, the light that would later blind him could not shine so brightly. Saul's zeal, though misaligned, was real. And in time, that zeal would be the very vessel through which the world would come to know the depths of God's grace. The road to Damascus began like any other for Saul. There was no thunder in the skies, no tremor beneath his feet, no sign that heaven was preparing to interrupt his journey. He held letters of authority, sanctioned by the high priests, and he traveled with the full weight of institutional power behind him. His purpose was simple in his eyes, righteous even. He intended to identify, arrest, and silence those who belonged to the way. These were men and women whose only offense was that they believed Jesus of Nazareth was alive, and that his resurrection had changed everything. For Saul, that belief was heresy wrapped in blasphemy, and Damascus was simply the next target in a long line of efforts to extinguish it. The road itself was well-traveled, a known route for traders, travelers, and officials. Saul, likely accompanied by others, would have journeyed under the bright heat of the eastern sun, focused not on the scenery around him, but on the names he planned to erase. His mind was disciplined and clear. Every step forward confirmed his commitment to a cause he believed to be sacred. The idea that he might be walking into the hands of the very one he sought to destroy would have seemed absurd, but heaven does not operate within the limits of human logic, and on that dusty road, heaven intervened. Without warning, a light brighter than midday burst across Saul's path. It was not natural brilliance, not sunlight refracted or fire from the sky. This light carried weight. It had presence. It did not just illuminate, it overwhelmed. In an instant, the man so confident in his purpose was brought to the ground. His balance failed him, his senses collapsed, and then came the voice. Not the voice of accusation or wrath, but one that carried authority so absolute it cut through every layer of Saul's identity. It called him by name, not once, but twice. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The words hung in the air, filled with both confrontation and compassion. Saul, blinded by the light, could not see the speaker, but he heard with clarity. Confusion overtook him, for the voice did not come from a priest or a soldier. It did not echo with the tones of earthly command. It was different. It spoke to the very core of his being. And so he asked, not defiantly, but with the stunned humility of a man whose entire world was beginning to unravel. "Who are you, Lord?" The answer was not softened to ease the shock. It came with directness, as truth always does. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." In that moment, everything Saul believed began to collapse. The figure he thought dead was speaking. The name he sought to erase was calling him personally, and the mission he thought divine was revealed to be rebellion. Saul had not been defending God, he had been attacking him, not through direct confrontation, but through the people who bore his name. Every arrest, every lash, every stone thrown at the innocent had been felt by the one speaking from the light. It was not just an intellectual reversal, it was a spiritual disintegration. His knowledge failed him. His arguments dissolved. What remained was silence, blindness, and trembling. He did not stand back up. He did not argue. He did not reach for the scrolls he had once used as weapons. Instead, he was led. The man who arrived on that road with power and vision now depended on others to guide him by the hand. He entered Damascus not as a persecutor, but as a broken man. And though his eyes remained open, he saw nothing. The blindness was not merely physical, it was the outward sign of an inner upheaval. Damascus was no longer just a city on a map, it had become sacred ground. The road, once a path to violence, had become a place of encounter. God had not simply redirected Saul's plans, he had arrested his soul, not with force, but with presence, not through fear, but through revelation. It was not punishment that fell on Saul. It was grace, disruptive, undeniable, and deeply personal. This encounter with Christ was not a vision conjured by guilt or exhaustion. It was a direct historical intrusion of the resurrected Jesus into the life of his most unlikely enemy. The same Jesus who had preached forgiveness from a cross now appeared with light and voice to the one breathing threats against his followers. And in doing so, he made a statement that would echo through every generation to follow. No one is unreachable. Not the zealous, not the violent, not the proud, not the mistaken. The worst offender can become the greatest messenger. The path meant for destruction can be rerouted into destiny. The persecutor can become the preacher. There was no crowd to witness the moment, no choir of angels, no grand procession, no grand. Just a man on the ground, a voice from heaven, and a silence that followed like a curtain being drawn across his former life. What began as a mission of wrath had been interrupted by mercy. Saul had met the very Christ he denied, and from that encounter, he would never recover. His sight was gone, but vision had begun to form. Not the kind shaped by study or sharpened by doctrine, but vision born of divine revelation. When Saul entered Damascus, it was not with the confident posture of a man on a mission. There was no arrival in power, no display of authority. He came not as an enforcer of law, but as a man stripped of control, unable to see, unable to lead, and wholly dependent on the very people he once sought to imprison. For 3 days, he sat in darkness. The world around him, once so vivid, reduced itself to a void. This was not simply the absence of sight, it was the unraveling of a man. And in that unraveling, a deeper work began. Blindness has a way of slowing everything down. Without the visual noise of the world, Saul was left alone with his thoughts. And for the first time, those thoughts were no longer filtered through the lens of certainty. His mind, once fortified by scripture and tradition, now echoed with questions he could no longer suppress. Who was Jesus really? How had he missed the truth so completely? What would become of him now? The man who once relied on his intellect, who once debated in synagogues with precise arguments, now found himself mute in the presence of his own conscience. This silence was not merely circumstantial, it was sacred. Saul chose not to eat, not to drink. This was no ordinary fast. It was not the result of religious observance or ritual obligation. It was the expression of a soul in crisis. Food held no meaning. Water did not soothe. His appetite had collapsed under the weight of revelation. He had seen light, heard a voice, and lost everything he thought was secure. The absence of vision became a mirror, reflecting every moment he had lifted his hand against the followers of Jesus. Every name on his list, every cry he had ignored, every plea he had silenced, came flooding back with unbearable clarity. And in that stillness, guilt took shape. But guilt, in the hands of God, is not a weapon. It is a doorway. And through that doorway walked something Saul could not have expected: mercy. Though it came wrapped in blindness and silence, though it came through disruption rather than invitation, mercy had arrived. Saul was not abandoned in his blindness. He was being prepared. The physical darkness mirrored the spiritual cleansing underway, a cleansing that would leave him not merely changed, but reborn. Elsewhere in the city, another man was receiving a different kind of instruction. His name was Ananias, a believer, devout and ordinary. When the Lord spoke to him in a vision, calling him to visit Saul, his response was immediate, but not with eagerness. Fear gripped his heart, for Saul's reputation had preceded him. Ananias had heard the stories, knew the danger, and could not reconcile the idea that such a man might now be called a brother. The name Saul did not evoke thoughts of redemption, only memories of harm. And yet God's message was clear: Saul was chosen. This was not just a test of obedience for Ananias. It was a test of faith in grace itself. Could he believe that a man with blood on his hands could now carry light in his voice? Could he trust that the enemy of yesterday might become the instrument of hope tomorrow? Forgiveness is never easy, but it is hardest when the wound is fresh and the scars still tender. Ananias was not being asked to merely visit a man in need. He was being asked to touch him, to restore him, to call him brother. That kind of courage does not come from tolerance. It comes from revelation. When Ananias finally stood before Saul, it was not with condemnation. There were no accusations, no lectures. He placed his hands gently upon the blinded man and spoke words that would echo through eternity. Brother Saul. 2 words, simple yet profound. In them was the acknowledgement of transformation. In them was the hope that God had truly begun a new work. As Ananias prayed, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. His vision returned, but it was not the same vision he had before. He could see, yes, but more importantly, he could perceive. The veil had been lifted, and the world looked entirely different now. The healing of Saul's eyes was not just a medical miracle, it was a symbolic act. The blindness that once isolated him had now been used to awaken him. His sight returned, but his perspective had been rewritten. Vulnerability had done its work. In the absence of strength, in the quiet of confusion, Saul had become ready. Ready to be guided, ready to be changed, ready to be sent. These 3 days in Damascus, though short in number, were vast in their impact. They were the furnace of rebirth, the quiet chamber in which a persecutor began to die and an apostle began to live. Saul did not leave that room the same man who had entered it. His heart, once hard, had been broken open. His pride, once towering, had been humbled. His mind, once certain, had been reshaped by grace. And none of it happened in public. It happened in silence, in weakness, in blindness. God often does his deepest work in the unseen places, not on stages or in crowds, but in the stillness of surrender. And that is where Saul's journey took its next breath. Not in debate, but in darkness. Not in victory, but in vulnerability. The restoration of Saul's sight marked a profound turning point, but it was only the beginning of what would become a life consumed by purpose. The moment his vision returned, it was not only his eyes that opened. A new awareness, born from surrender and shaped by encounter, began to take root. He did not linger in contemplation, nor did he retreat into solitude. He rose with clarity, no longer as the man who came to Damascus to arrest, but as one who had been arrested by the very truth he once denied. Almost immediately, Saul submitted to baptism. It was not a ceremonial gesture, nor a symbolic act of polite alignment with a new religious group. For him, this baptism marked death and birth simultaneously. It was the burying of an identity built on law, on persecution, on self-righteous ambition. And from the water emerged a man washed by grace, not by works. Though still known by the name Saul for a time, what took place in those moments made way for the man who would later be called Paul, apostle not by human appointment, but by divine commission. His baptism did not grant him safety. It granted him a new kind of danger. The very community he had come to destroy was now the one he longed to join. And yet, the doors did not swing wide. Suspicion was natural, fear understandable. His reputation had been carved deep into the memories of believers across the region. For many, the name Saul did not evoke redemption. It summoned dread. How could they believe that the man who had torn families apart could now call them brothers and sisters? Saul did not blame them. He understood what his past had done. And yet he pressed forward, not with defensiveness, but with quiet determination. In those early days, he did not wait for full acceptance to act. He began to preach, not in whispers, not in safe places, but in synagogues. The same buildings where he once stood to argue against Jesus were now the stages from which he proclaimed that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. His voice, once used to denounce the followers of the Way, now testified boldly of the risen Christ. It was as if a dam had burst. All the knowledge he had once used to justify violence was now employed to demonstrate truth. The scriptures he had studied for years came alive in his hands. The prophecies he once saw through the lens of tradition now revealed a Messiah who had suffered, died, and risen, and Saul, of all people, could not keep silent. His former allies were not confused for long. They were enraged. The man they had trusted to enforce the purity of the faith had turned traitor in their eyes. The betrayal was not minor, it was total. To declare Jesus as Lord was to dismantle the foundation of the old order, to threaten power, tradition, and control. Plots were formed. Walls began to close in. Saul had moved from hunter to hunted, and the transition was not theoretical. It was real, immediate, and life-threatening. But Saul did not shrink from it. His new faith was not a shelter from pain. It was a path into it. His baptism had not baptized him into comfort. It had called him into suffering, and he accepted that cost without hesitation. The fire that once burned with zeal for destruction now burned with conviction for truth. And it was this fire that sustained him when doors remained closed, when friendships evaporated, and when his very life hung in the balance. Those first days of preaching were not polished or perfected. They were raw, fervent, and full of the tension between past and present. Each word Saul spoke carried the weight of his history and the urgency of his calling. He was not interested in reforming his image. He was consumed with revealing the Christ he had seen. The response he received was mixed. Some were astonished, others skeptical, many hostile. But Saul did not retreat. The man who had once been feared for his violence was now feared for his truth. It was in this crucible of suspicion and danger that Saul began to understand the true nature of his calling. To follow Jesus was not to escape hardship, it was to embrace it with purpose. Every step forward would now be contested, every message opposed, every act of love shadowed by the memory of his past. But he walked into that tension willingly. His life was no longer his own. The name he had once tried to erase from history was now the name by which he would live, suffer, and eventually die. Baptism had marked more than a spiritual shift. It had initiated a life of resistance, not against flesh and blood, but against the forces of darkness that tremble at the sound of grace. Saul, now changed, stepped into his mission not as one seeking peace for himself, but as one commissioned to proclaim peace to others. And with every word he spoke, with every risk he took, the fire within him grew brighter, consuming what remained of the old and forging what was to come. The early church had seen miracles. It had heard the testimonies of those who walked with Jesus, who had witnessed him resurrected and ascended. But nothing quite prepared the believers for the sight of Saul of Tarsus standing among them, no longer a threat, but a brother. The transformation was so stark, so sudden, that many could not reconcile the man before them with the memories of the man they had feared. His reputation had traveled faster than the gospel in some places, and the shadow of his past followed him into every room he entered. Forgiveness, though a central teaching of Christ, is rarely immediate when the wounds are still healing. For the church in Jerusalem, acceptance of Saul was not instinctual. It had to be wrestled with. Paul, as he would later be known, carried a past that spoke louder than any claim of conversion. To the believers who had seen friends imprisoned, who had buried loved ones because of persecution, his presence raised questions no testimony could instantly silence. Was this a trick, a trap? Had he come to infiltrate the movement from within? The skepticism was not rooted in pettiness, but in the raw fear of survival. For those who had lived in hiding, who had met in secret to break bread and share prayers, trust was more than an emotion, it was a risk. Paul did not lash out at their caution. He did not demand instant acceptance. Instead, he began a quiet, deliberate journey of rebuilding trust. One conversation at a time, one act of humility after another, he let his life speak before his words could gain traction. In time, men like Barnabas stepped forward, not merely to defend him, but to walk beside him. Barnabas, known for his encouragement and discernment, saw beyond Paul's history and into his heart. He vouched for him before the apostles, not as a favor, but as a witness to what God had clearly begun. This act of courage would become a critical turning point, not only for Paul, but for the church as a whole. Paul's past, heavy as it was, became the very platform from which he spoke of grace. His message was not detached, not theoretical. It was personal, grounded in experience, and impossible to dismiss. He knew what it meant to stand against God's work, to be blind in the name of zeal, and to be rescued not because he deserved mercy, but because mercy chose him. That depth of understanding could not be taught. It had to be lived. And so his preaching carried an authenticity that cut through pretense and pierced straight to the heart. He was not offering distant theology. He was offering his own transformed life as evidence that no one, absolutely no one, was beyond redemption. Everywhere Paul went, the contrast between his former self and his present mission was on full display. To some, it was a source of curiosity. To others, a threat. Former allies who once celebrated his passion for the law now viewed him as a traitor to tradition. They did not merely disagree with him, they sought to silence him. Plots surfaced, whispers spread, and in some cities, mobs gathered. His life from this point on would be lived under constant pressure, both from within the church and from those outside it. But Paul did not flinch. The fire that had once fueled his crusade against the followers of Jesus had not died. It had been purified. That same intensity now served a different purpose. As Paul moved through the early Christian communities, he did so not with arrogance, but with a startling humility. He did not hide from his past. He referenced it often, not to dwell in shame, but to magnify the grace that had rescued him. He called himself the least of the apostles, not as false modesty, but as a man fully aware of what he had been spared from. He did not consider his prior sins a disqualifier. Instead, he treated them as a backdrop that made the mercy of God shine more brightly. His story was not a clean slate. It was a testimony layered with pain, redemption, and relentless purpose. What made Paul's transformation so compelling was not just that he changed, but how thoroughly he changed. His intellect was still sharp, his knowledge of the law still intact, his command of language and reason still formidable. But all of these tools, once used to dominate, were now used to uplift. His letters, arguments, and sermons were not born from a place of superiority, but from the profound realization that he had been wrong, desperately wrong. And in being wrong, he had been met not with wrath, but with a love so overwhelming that it demanded his whole life in response. God had taken the least likely candidate and made him a cornerstone in the expansion of the church. And in doing so, he sent a message to every generation that would follow, that his calling is not reserved for the morally polished or the religiously perfect. It is for the broken, the mistaken, the dangerous, and the despised. The very things that disqualified Paul in the eyes of others were the things that qualified him in the eyes of heaven. His past became his pulpit. His former violence became the backdrop for a message of peace. His weakness became the very channel through which strength was revealed. Paul did not erase his former identity. He carried it with him, not as a burden, but as a banner. It reminded him daily of the grace he had received, and it reminded others that change was not only possible, it was inevitable when God intervened. He had been the enemy. Now he was the evangelist, and his life would never again belong to himself. Once Paul's calling was affirmed, once the community of believers began to see in him not a traitor but a torchbearer, he did not retreat into comfort or tradition. He set out instead with a sense of urgency that bordered on the uncontainable. His was not a mission that waited for the ideal conditions or the promise of safety. It was driven by a fire that refused to be quieted. From city to city, across deserts and seas, through storm and silence, Paul moved with a singular aim: to make known the name of Jesus Christ to those who had never heard it. His steps became sermons, and his suffering a testimony. The journey was never easy. Paul's path took him across the vast landscapes of Asia Minor and into the complex cities of Greece, places filled with gods and philosophies, temples and idols, pride and despair. In Lystra, he was mistaken for a god after healing a crippled man, only to be stoned by the same crowd shortly afterward. In Athens, he stood before intellectual elites who mocked the idea of resurrection, yet some among them leaned in, intrigued by the power behind his words. In every setting, Paul adapted, not compromising the message, but meeting people where they were, speaking to Jews in the language of covenant and to Gentiles in the language of conscience. He did not preach from a distance. He stepped into their world with conviction and compassion. Miracles followed him, not as spectacles, but as confirmations. When a slave girl in Philippi, possessed by a spirit of divination, followed Paul and Silas for days, shouting about their identity as servants of the Most High, Paul turned and commanded the spirit to leave her. It did, instantly. But the backlash was swift. The girl's owners, furious over the loss of their income, incited a mob. Paul and Silas were beaten, stripped, and thrown into prison. And here in the darkness of a cell, with wounds still fresh and chains still tight, Paul did something unexpected. He sang. It was midnight, the hour when hope is often at its weakest. Yet from within the prison walls came not groans of defeat, but songs of praise. The other prisoners listened, perhaps stunned, perhaps moved, as melodies of worship rose from those who had every reason to fall silent. This moment was not about performance. It was about presence. Paul's spirit was not bound by iron. His joy was not conditioned by freedom. The same man who once broke down doors to drag believers into the light was now praising God behind locked doors, carrying light into the darkest corners. Then came the earthquake. The ground trembled, the doors flew open, and the chains of every prisoner fell. But Paul did not flee. He understood that his freedom was not for escape, but for purpose. The jailer, overwhelmed by fear and awe, prepared to take his own life, thinking the prisoners had escaped. Paul stopped him with a cry, assuring him they were still there. That moment of integrity, that refusal to abandon even those who held him captive, broke the jailer's heart wide open. He fell at their feet, trembling, not in fear of man, but in awe of God. And that night, the man who had once chained Paul would wash his wounds, listen to his testimony, and be baptized along with his entire household. Such was the pattern of Paul's ministry: miracle entwined with suffering, opposition followed by revelation. He did not seek applause, he expected resistance, yet everywhere he went, lives changed. Demons were silenced, the sick were healed, and the gospel found its way into homes, marketplaces, and hearts. Paul did not move as a celebrity or philosopher. He traveled as a servant, willing to be poured out, willing to be misunderstood, willing to be broken if that meant someone else might be made whole. His strength was not found in strategy, but in surrender. Whether he was debating in synagogues or crafting tents with his own hands to support the work, Paul's aim was always the same: to proclaim Christ crucified, risen, and reigning. He bore in his body the marks of suffering, and in his soul the unshakable assurance that he had been called not to comfort, but to transformation. He did not fear the beatings, the imprisonments, or the betrayals. What he feared was silence, the failure to speak when the Spirit prompted him to speak. And so he kept moving, kept preaching, kept loving with a heart that had once known only rage. The missionary journeys were more than travel narratives. They were battlegrounds for truth. In each city, Paul confronted not just human opposition, but spiritual darkness. Every new believer, every fledgling church, every household baptized became a testament to the gospel's power to resurrect what seemed dead. Paul's life in this season was a rhythm of movement and stillness, proclamation and persecution, miracles and mundane labor. But through it all, he remained centered, not in self-confidence, but in the grace that had first met him on a road to Damascus. That grace did not promise ease, but it did promise purpose. And Paul, driven not by ego but by calling, embraced it all, the highs and the lows, the songs and the scars. Imprisonment might have silenced a lesser man. Confinement could have brought bitterness, resignation, or quiet despair. But for Paul, chains were never the end of influence. If anything, they became the channel through which his voice reached farther. His words dug deeper, and his legacy took root in places his feet would never travel. In the stillness of stone walls and iron restraints, Paul's pen became a vessel of fire. What the empire intended as restriction, God transformed into a megaphone. Through parchment and ink, Paul would shape hearts, correct minds, and console souls, not just in his generation, but in every generation to come. These letters, now known as epistles, are not dry theology or distant moral instruction. They are alive with the voice of a man whose body was confined, but whose spirit soared. When he wrote to the Philippians, it was not with the gloom of a prisoner lamenting his fate. It was with the joy of a man who had learned to rejoice not in the absence of suffering, but in its presence. "Rejoice in the Lord always," he wrote, from behind bars, fully aware that his trial might end in execution. His joy was not a surface emotion. It was forged in hardship, anchored in the presence of Christ. The words poured onto those pages with a tenderness that can only come from someone who has found peace in the eye of the storm. In Philippians, Paul did not merely teach joy, he embodied it. He thanked the believers for their support, encouraged them to stand firm, and reminded them of the humility of Christ, who, though equal with God, did not grasp at glory, but emptied himself. These were not abstract reflections. They mirrored Paul's own descent from privilege to persecution, from Pharisee to servant, and in that descent he found not loss, but gain. What the world would call defeat, he called participation in the suffering of Christ, a fellowship deeper than comfort could ever offer. From his cell, Paul also wrote to the believers in Rome. Unlike the churches he had planted through personal visits, the Roman church had not yet seen his face. Yet the epistle to the Romans would become one of the most profound declarations of Christian doctrine ever written. It was not a letter of light instruction or passing encouragement. It was a theological masterpiece. Here, Paul laid bare the human condition, the universality of sin, and the astounding grace of God that justifies the ungodly. He unfolded the mystery of salvation by faith, traced the lineage of Abraham not by blood, but by belief, and exposed the limitations of the law while magnifying the power of the Spirit. This letter, though born in the confines of imprisonment, roared with the authority of divine truth. Paul addressed divisions between Jewish and Gentile believers, called for unity rooted in mercy, and challenged every reader to present their bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. He did not shrink from the hard teachings. He pressed into them, writing not for applause, but for transformation. His aim was not to impress, but to awaken. Every sentence bore the weight of revelation. Every paragraph built a bridge from doctrine to devotion. But Paul was not only a theologian or preacher, he was a spiritual father. This is most clearly seen in his letters to Timothy, a young leader navigating the complex world of early church ministry. These letters, pastoral and deeply personal, reveal a side of Paul often hidden behind the bold declarations of faith and courage. To Timothy, he gave not just instruction, but his heart. He urged him to guard what had been entrusted to him, to flee youthful passions, to be strong in grace, and to endure hardship like a good soldier of Christ. These were not theoretical exhortations. They were the distilled wisdom of a life poured out in service. In these letters, Paul's tone shifted from the proclamation of doctrine to the nurturing of a son. He spoke of perseverance, warned against false teaching, and reminded Timothy of the sacredness of Scripture, breathed out by God and useful for every aspect of life and faith. His words did not merely teach, they embraced. They reached across distance and circumstance to steady the hands of a young man standing at the edge of weariness. This was Paul at his most intimate, offering not just guidance, but legacy. What makes these prison letters so astonishing is not only their content, but their context. They were written in places of limitation, where Paul had no stage, no audience, no apparent influence. And yet they became the backbone of the New Testament. They were not hindered by iron bars or Roman decrees. They flowed with divine breath, moving from hand to hand, heart to heart, until they circled the globe. Through these letters, Paul became more than an apostle to his own time. He became a teacher for all time. Even in isolation, Paul never ceased to build. He built with words, he built through prayer, and he built by pouring himself into others. His surroundings may have changed, but his mission did not. In chains, he reminded others of freedom. In silence, he gave voice to truth. In weakness, he pointed to the strength that comes only from Christ. His body may have been held, but his message ran wild. The world often views prison as failure, as the end of influence. But in Paul's case, confinement was a crucible. It refined him, deepened him, and magnified the God he served. These letters, born from that furnace, continue to speak because they were never merely his. They were vessels of a higher voice, shaped by the hand of a man who refused to let captivity define him. For all of Paul's boldness, his relentless preaching, his deep theology and miraculous authority, his life was never untouched by pain. Beneath the public victories and the expanding churches, behind the letters that would shape the very fabric of Christian faith, there existed a private affliction, persistent, unnamed, and unresolved. Paul referred to it only as a thorn in the flesh, a phrase as enigmatic as it is evocative. He did not elaborate on the details, whether it was physical pain, emotional turmoil, or spiritual anguish. But he spoke of it with enough weight to suggest it pierced not just his body, but his spirit. This thorn was not fleeting. It followed him, interrupted him, humbled him, and in its endurance it revealed the true cost and character of spiritual strength. 3 times Paul pleaded with the Lord to remove it. These were not passing prayers or half-hearted requests. They came from a man familiar with divine power. A man who had seen the dead raised, demons cast out, and entire cities transformed. He knew what it meant for God to act. He knew how it felt to pray and receive immediate response. Yet in this, the silence lingered. The heavens did not open with deliverance. The affliction remained, stubborn and unexplained. For all the revelation Paul received, this was one area where clarity was withheld. The man who had been caught up into paradise, who heard things too wonderful for human tongues, could not escape this ordinary ache. And yet, it was in that unanswered prayer that a greater answer came. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. These words did not offer escape, but they offered something deeper, an invitation to view suffering not as failure, but as formation. Paul, in that moment, was not merely given endurance, he was given understanding. Weakness, rather than being the disqualifier of power, was its very container. The thorn did not negate his calling, it grounded it. It reminded him that his authority did not spring from brilliance or strength, but from surrender. His ministry was not powered by perfection, but by dependence. This is perhaps the most startling dimension of Paul's life. He, more than any other, might have seemed to qualify for a life free from torment. After all, he had given up everything. He endured shipwrecks, imprisonments, betrayals, sleepless nights, and countless threats. He had traveled relentlessly, borne the weight of many churches, and poured himself out day after day. If anyone could have argued for relief, for a break from suffering, it was Paul. And yet, the thorn remained, not as punishment, but as purpose. Rather than resent it, Paul eventually embraced it. He wrote that he would boast all the more gladly in his weaknesses so that the power of Christ might rest on him. He did not minimize his pain. He did not pretend it made him stronger in human terms. What he discovered was far more profound, that the throne of grace often rests on the foundation of a humbled heart. Where ego fades, power flows. Where pride is stripped, God's presence becomes unmistakable. This thorn, though never named, became a thread woven through all Paul did. It colored his empathy, deepened his letters, and shaped the tenderness with which he corrected others. He was not speaking from a distance when he urged believers to endure, to trust, to persevere. He knew the cost. He felt the weight, and still he believed. His authority came not just from truth spoken, but from truth lived. He did not rise above suffering. He walked through it and taught others how to do the same. For every reader who has ever wrestled with unanswered prayers, Paul's testimony becomes a companion. It reminds the wounded that silence is not abandonment, that pain does not disqualify, and that grace is not always loud. Sometimes it comes quietly, steadily, enough for the next step. The thorn that remained became the throne from which Paul learned to rule his own heart, not through control, but through surrender. He never claimed to have mastered suffering. What he claimed was something more honest, that he had met God there, not in triumph, but in tension, not in clarity, but in contradiction. And in that place, he discovered a deeper kind of strength, the kind that cannot be earned, only received. Paul's final years unfolded not with quiet retirement or honor from the world he had turned upside down, but with the relentless pressure of opposition, the narrowing circle of betrayal, and the cold reality of imprisonment. His journey, marked from the beginning by danger and defiance, did not ease with time. If anything, the weight grew heavier. Age had taken its toll on his body, scars had become his constant companions, and the cities he once visited with boldness now remembered him with mixed emotions. Some saw him as a heretic, others as a revolutionary, a few as a saint. Yet through every shifting opinion, Paul remained anchored to a single truth, that his life was not his own. The Roman Empire, indifferent to spiritual matters and governed by power and pride, saw Paul as a threat. He did not lead armies or stir revolts with swords, but his words disrupted systems, his teachings challenged emperors, and his gospel created allegiance to a kingdom not of this world. It was only a matter of time before that tension reached its boiling point. Arrested once again, and now standing under the authority of Nero, a ruler intoxicated by control and paranoia, Paul knew this was not like previous imprisonments. The end was near, not as failure, but as fulfillment. During these final days, Paul's thoughts were not consumed with fear, but with faith. He did not write from a place of despair. Instead, he offered encouragement, counsel, and calm assurance. To Timothy, his spiritual son and trusted protege, he penned some of the most poignant words of his entire ministry. They did not speak of regret, nor did they express resentment for what was lost. They formed a testimony carved from endurance and trust. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. These were not the boasts of a man clinging to legacy. They were the confession of a servant who had held nothing back. To fight the good fight for Paul meant more than surviving hardship. It meant staying true when compromise would have been easier. It meant proclaiming truth when silence would have been safer. It meant loving those who abandoned him, forgiving those who opposed him, and never allowing bitterness to grow roots where grace was meant to flourish. His battles were many, some external, against rulers and mobs, and others internal, against weariness and doubt. But through them all, he kept moving forward, not because he was invincible, but because he had learned to draw strength from the one who never failed. To finish the race was not to arrive in ease or to be surrounded by applause. It was to cross the line having poured out everything he had. Paul knew that obedience is not measured by duration alone, but by depth. He had not coasted into old age. He had pressed on. From Jerusalem to Rome, from marketplaces to courtrooms, he had run with clarity. Every step, every detour, every setback had been part of a larger journey, one that pointed not to his own endurance, but to the faithfulness of the one who had called him. And now, as his time drew to a close, he did not fear what lay ahead. He anticipated it. To keep the faith was Paul's greatest accomplishment, not because faith came easily, but because it had been tested, refined, and proven true. When others abandoned the gospel, when false teachers rose within the church, when persecution grew fiercer, Paul did not bend. He held to the promise that had first blinded him with light and awakened him with love. He did not rely on charisma or legacy to carry him through. He held on to Christ, and that grip, forged in trial and watered with tears, never loosened. There is no precise record of Paul's final moments. Tradition tells us he was executed under Nero's reign, likely beheaded outside the walls of Rome. There were no public memorials, no golden honors, just the quiet ending of a life that had never belonged to this world. But if heaven could be heard, there would have been a chorus. For in that moment, Paul stepped from the dust of earth into the glory of eternity, not with shame, but with the satisfaction of a race well run. He had finished, not just in body, but in heart. His final breath was not defeat. It was the moment the crown he had long spoken of became real. Paul's life challenges every notion that faith is meant to shield us from pain or to secure ease. His path tells a different story, that obedience often leads into hardship, that calling can coexist with suffering, and that the greatest reward is not in what is built here, but in what is prepared there. He lived with the end in view, not as a point of dread, but as a moment of reward. And he calls every listener, every reader, every believer to do the same, to finish not merely with breath in our lungs, but with purpose in our steps and faith still burning within. The story of Paul is not locked in history. It is not confined to the dust of ancient roads or the ink of sacred letters. It lives because it touches something universal, something deeply human. Behind the names, the cities, the sermons, and the miracles is a man whose journey speaks into every heart that has ever wandered far and wondered if they could still be used by God. Paul's life, as extraordinary as it was, does not stand above us like a monument. It walks beside us like a companion. His journey from Saul to Paul is not just a narrative of transformation. It is a divine invitation. It reminds us that no one begins too far from grace, that zeal, even when misdirected, can become passion when guided by truth, that mistakes, no matter how great, are not final when mercy intervenes. Saul the persecutor did not become Paul the apostle because he earned forgiveness. He became Paul because grace chose him, broke him, and rebuilt him from the inside out. There is a Damascus road in every life. It may not be lined with soldiers or marked by a blinding light, but there is always a moment when truth interrupts the path we have chosen. A moment when what we thought was right begins to unravel, and what we tried to silence begins to speak. For some, it is sudden, for others, slow. But the voice is the same, calling not with condemnation, but with compassion, asking not for perfection, but for surrender. Paul's letters are not relics of a bygone era. They are blueprints for today, whispers of wisdom, pillars of doctrine, and echoes of a heart that beat not for itself, but for others. In his words, we find courage to stand, to endure, to love without condition. We find the permission to be weak, to struggle, to confess our need, and still know we are not disqualified. Because Paul did not hide his pain or his past. He placed them in the open so that grace might be seen more clearly. His story belongs to every person who has ever felt unworthy, to every heart carrying guilt too heavy to name, to every soul who wonders if it is too late. Paul would tell you it is not. He would remind you that the same Christ who met him in wrathful pursuit now waits for you with open arms, that your past does not intimidate God, that your wounds are not a barrier, they are the places where healing begins. And when you feel alone in the call, when faith feels fragile, when obedience feels costly, remember the man who sang in prison, who wrote of joy with shackles on his wrists, who clung to hope when death stood at his door. Remember that he, too, once fought against the very truth he would die to proclaim. Remember that God saw him not for what he had done, but for what he could become. And if that is true for Paul, then it is true for you. You are not beyond reach. Your story is not too broken to be used. Your doubts are not too loud to be calmed. And the road you are on, no matter how misguided it has been, can still lead to purpose if you let grace interrupt it. Paul's life is proof that what matters most is not where you started, but who you allow to shape your ending. So take heart. Whether you feel like the hunter or the hunted, the faithful or the failure, you are not alone. His story was extraordinary, but its message is simple. God chooses the unlikely, redeems the unworthy, and writes beauty into the lives of those who are willing to follow, even when the road is hard. If this message has touched your heart, we invite you to become part of this journey. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that brings hope. If this video encouraged you, click the like button. It helps others discover the same message of truth and grace. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment below and share what resonated most with you. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone you care about. You never know how one story can open the door to transformation in another person's life.